The Brothers Karamazov, Book 7, A Judicial Error, Subsection 12, Nor was there even any murder. Page 936. I must ask you to reflect, gentlemen of the jury, that a human life is involved here and that it is necessary to be more careful. We have heard the prosecution itself testify that right up to the very last day, until today, the day of the trial, it hesitated to accuse the defendant of complete and outright premeditation of the murder, and that its hesitation lasted right until the presentation of this fateful, drunken letter to the court today. It was performed as out of a book. But again I repeat, it was to her that he came running, for her, solely in order to learn where she was. Now that is an absolute fact. Had she happened to be at home, he would not have gone running anywhere. He would have remained with her, and would have not fulfilled what he had promised in the letter. He came running haphazardly and suddenly, and as for his drunken letter, he may not have been drinking about it all. He may not have been thinking about it at the time at all. He snatched the pestle, we are told, and you will recall how from this pestle alone an entire psychology was inferred for us. Why he is bound to see that pestle as a weapon, snatch hold of it as a weapon, etc., etc. At this juncture, there occurs to me a certain most commonplace thought. Well, what if that pestle had not been lying in full view, and instead of being on a shelf from which the defendant was able to snatch it, it had been put away in a cupboard? Why, then, it would not have flashed before the defendant's gaze, and he would have run off without a weapon, empty-handed, and then might perhaps never have murdered anyone. By what manner of means may I then make conclusions regarding the pestle as a proof of armament and premeditation? Yes, but he had gone shouting around the inns, and that he was going to kill his father, and 2 days before, on the evening he wrote his drunken letter, was quiet and quarrelled only with the merchant's assistant, because, we are told, Karamazov could not but quarrel. But I will reply to that. If he had schemed such a murder, according to a plan, according to some written word, he would certainly not have quarrelled with the assistant, and might perhaps not have visited the inn at all, because a soul that is scheming such a deed seeks silence and unnoticeability, seeks to disappear, so that it may neither be seen or heard, as if to say, forget about me if you can. And this is not from calculation alone, but from instinct. Gentlemen of the jury, psychology is a thing with two ends, and we are also able to understand psychology. And as regards that shouting in the inns all that month, then surely it is not uncommon for children, or drunken layabouts, emerging from the drinking houses, quarrelling with one another, to shout, I'm going to kill you! But they do not actually do it. And this very same fateful letter, well, is it not also a drunken anger? The shout of a man emerging from a drinking house. I'm going to kill you. I'm going to kill the lot of you. Why may it not be so? Why could it not have been so? This letter, why is it so fateful? Why, on the contrary, is it not ridiculous? From the very reason that the corpse of the murdered father was found, that a witness saw the defendant in the garden, armed and running away, and was himself cast down by him, and consequently it was performed the way it was written, and so the letter is not ridiculous, but fateful. Thanks be to God, we have arrived at the point of our endeavor. If he was in the garden, that means he was the murderer. The whole thing, the entire case for the prosecution, may be reduced to those two expressions. If he was, followed by that means. But what if there is no that means, even though he was? Oh, I recognize that the weight of the facts, the concurrence of the facts are indeed rather eloquent. I should like you, however, to examine each of these facts separately, without being hypnotized by the combined weight. Why, for example, is the prosecution on no account willing to admit the veracity of the defendant's statement that he ran away from his father's window? Recall the positive sarcasms upon which the prosecution embarks here with regards to the deference and the pious emotions that suddenly seized the murderer. But what if something of that kind actually did occur within him? That is to say, if not the deference of emotion, then the piety of one. My mother must have been praying for me at that moment, the defendant testified at the investigation. And you see, he ran away as soon as he ascertained that Svetlova was not in his father's house, but he could not have done so through the window. The prosecution retort to us, but why not? After all, the window was open in response to the signals that were given by the defendant. At that point, Fyodor Pavlovitch might have uttered some word or other, let escape some cry, and the defendant would suddenly have received confirmation that Svetlova was not there. Why must we necessarily presume it to be as we imagine, or have we presumed to imagine? In reality, there may be glimmer 1,000 things that elude the observation of the most subtle romancier. Yes, but Gregory saw the door open, and therefore the defendant must certainly have been in the house, and therefore he committed the murder. Concerning this door, gentlemen of the jury, you see, concerning this door open, there is only one person who is able to give testimony, a person who has, however, at that time in such a condition that but let us assume that the door was open, that the defendant denied it, told a lie about it, out of a sense of self-preservation, so understandable in his position. Let us assume that he penetrated into the house, was in the house. Well, what of it? Why, if he was there, must he so certainly have committed murder? Whoa, this is getting super interesting, man. All right, back to the book. He could have burst in, run from room to room, pushed his father aside, even struck him, but having ascertained that Svetlova was not within the house, run away, rejoicing that she was not there and that he had fled and had not killed his father. Whoa. Oh, that's a really good point. For that very reason also may he have leapt down a minute later from the fence to the side of Grigory, whom he had cast down in his extreme excitement, and that he was in a condition to experience an emotion that was pure, an emotion of compassion and pity, for the reason that he had fled from the temptation to kill his father, had experienced within himself the emotions of a pure heart and the joy that he had not killed his father. Eloquently, to the point of horror, does the prosecutor describe to us the dreadful condition of the defendant in the village of Mokroy, when love had once more revealed itself to him, summoning him to a new life, and when it was already impossible for him to love, because behind him lay the bloodied corpse of his father, and beyond that corpse, retribution. Yet even so, the prosecutor still wishes to assume that there was love, which he explains in terms of his psychology. The defendant's drunken condition, he tells us. Criminals have to be taken to the place of their doom. There is still a long time to wait, etc., etc. But, Mr. Prosecutor, again I ask you, have you not created another character? Is he so insensitive and callous, the defendant, that at the moment he was still capable of thinking at that moment of love and of prevarication before the court, if the blood of his father really lay upon his hands? No, no, and no. No sooner was it revealed that she loved him, was summoning him to go with her, promising him new happiness. Oh, I swear he would have been bound to feel a triple need to kill himself, and would indeed have done so without fail, had his father's corpse been lying there behind him. Oh no, he would not have forgotten where his pistols were. I know the defendant. The wild, wooden heartlessness that is laid by the prosecution at his door is not in keeping with his character. He would not have killed himself. This is certain. He did not kill himself, for the specific reason that his mother prayed for him, and his heart was innocent of the blood of his father. He suffered torments, he grieved that night in Mokroy, only for the old man Grigory whom he had cast down, and prayed inwardly to God that the old man would arise and regain consciousness, that his blow had not been fatal, and that retribution for it would not come to him. Why not accept such an interpretation of events? What firm proof do we have that the defendant is lying to us? Well, there is the father's corpse. It will be indicated to us once again. He ran outside, he committed no murder. Well, who was it then? Murdered the old man. I repeat, here is all the logic of the prosecution. Who could have committed the murder, if not he? There is no one, it says. Whom may we put in his place? Gentlemen of the jury, is that really so? Is that really and truly no one at all whom we may put in his place? We heard the prosecution count on his fingers all who were in the house, or who visited it that night. There were 5 people. 3 of them, I agree, are completely excluded for obvious reasons. They are the murdered man himself, the old man Grigory, and his wife. There remain consequently the defendant and Smerdyakov. And now the prosecutor claims with enthusiasm that the defendant has identified Smerdyakov as the murderer because there is no one else whom he may so identify. That were there some 6th person, or even the ghost of some 6th person, the defendant would immediately, in shame, stop accusing Smerdyakov, and point to that 6th person. But, gentlemen of the jury, why may I not conclude that entirely the opposite is true? 2 men stand before us, the defendant and Smerdyakov. Then why may I not say that you accuse my client solely because you have no one else whom you may accuse? And that is so only because you have in a complete in a completely prejudiced manner, excluded Smerdyakov from all suspicion in advance. Yes, to be sure, the only people who had to point Smerdyakov are the defendant, his two brothers, and Svetlova, and they would appear to be the only ones. But in fact there are also others. There is a certain, though obscure, ferment in the social circles of this town with regard to a question, a suspicion. There is in circulation a kind of obscure rumor. There is a feeling that something may be expected to come to light. There is finally the testimony of a certain juxtaposition of facts, one thoroughly characteristic, though, I admit, also ill-defined. In the first place, this fit of the falling sickness on the very day of the catastrophe, a fit which the prosecutor was for some reason so painstakingly compelled to defend and vindicate. Then this sudden suicide of Smerdyakov on the eve of the trial. Then the no less sudden statement at the trial today by the defendant's elder brother, who until now had believed his brother's guilt, and who suddenly came in with the money, and also again proclaimed the name of Smerdyakov as the murderer. Oh, I am completely convinced, together with the court and the public procurator's office, that Ivan Karamazov is ill, and in acute fever, that his statement may indeed have been a desperate attempt, devised, what is more, in delirium, to rescue his brother by unloading the guilt onto the dead man. All the same, however, the name of Smerdyakov has been uttered, and again it is as though there were a whiff of mystery. It is as though something there had not been spoken to the end, gentlemen of the jury, and not concluded, and perhaps it will be spoken to the end. But let us leave that for the present. That still lies ahead. The court decided earlier to resume its sitting, but in the meanwhile, as we wait, I should like to make some observations. For example, concerning the characterization of the deceased Smerdyakov, so subtly, and with such talent outlined by the prosecutor. Much as I wonder at his talent, I am, however, unable to concur entirely with the essence of his characterization. I went to see Smerdyakov. I saw him, and I spoke to him. He produced upon me an impression of quite a different sort. His health was weak, that is true, but in character and heart. No, he was in no wise such a weak man as the prosecution has concluded in his regard. In particular, I found in him no timidity. That timidity that was described for us so characteristically by the prosecutor. As for the ingenuousness, there was none of that in him at all. On the contrary, I found a terrible suspiciousness that lurked beneath an outward show of naivete, and a mind that was capable of contemplating rather a great deal. Oh, too ingenuously did the prosecution consider him to be feeble-minded. Upon me he produced a very definite impression. I went away with the conviction that this was being of decided malice. I went away with the conviction that this was a being of decided malice, possessed of an inordinate ambition, a vengefulness, and torrid envy. I've collected certain information. He had a hatred of his origins, was ashamed of them, and would, with grinding of his teeth, recollect that he had proceeded from the stinker. For his former benefactors, the manservant Grigory and his wife, he had a lack of deference. Russia, he cursed, and poured derision on her. He dreamed of going away to France in order to transform himself into a Frenchman. Much and often had he talked of it before, saying that he had insufficient means thereto. I believe that he loved no one but himself, and had a strangely high regard for himself. Education he saw in good clothes, clean dickies, and polished boots. Viewing himself as he did, there is factual evidence in support of his view, as Fyodor Pavlovitch's illegitimate son, he might as well have hated this situation when compared with that of his master's legitimate children. They, he might have reflected, would get everything, while he got nothing. They would get all the rights, the inheritance, while he was only a cook. He revealed to me that he himself had, together with Fyodor Pavlovitch, put the money away in the envelope. The destination of this sum, a sum that might have made his career, was, of course, something hateful to him. To make it worse, he had sent the 3,000 rubles in nice, bright rainbow credit bills. I made a special point of asking him about that. Oh, never show a vain and envious man a large amount of money at once, and this was the first time that he had seen such a sum in a single hand. The effect of seeing the rainbow wad may have morbidly influenced his imagination, at first and for the time being without any consequences. The highly talented prosecutor has outlined for us, with uncommon subtlety, all the pros and contras of the supposition that it may be possible to accuse Smerdyakov of having committed the murder, and asked, in particular, why should the latter have feigned the falling sickness? Yes, but after all, he might not have been feigning it at all. The fit may have come upon him quite naturally, but passed quite naturally, too, and the sick man regained consciousness. Not that he was entirely better, but that he nonetheless at some point came to himself and regained consciousness, as is often the case in the falling sickness. The prosecution asks, at what moment did Smerdyakov commit the murder? But to identify that moment is extremely easy. He might have regained consciousness, risen from a deep slumber, for he was only asleep. After fits of the falling sickness, a deep slumber invariably ensues. At that very moment, that the old man Grigory, having seized the defendant by the leg where, seated upon the fence, he was trying to run away, howled, "Father murderer!" so it could be heard all over the entire neighborhood. This cry, unusual as it was in the quiet and the murk, might also have woken Smerdyakov, whose slumber by that time might not have been very sound. He might naturally have begun to wake up an hour before this. Having risen from his bed, he sets almost unconsciously and without any plan in the direction of the cry, in order to see what happened. In his head there is a morbid stupor. His reason is still a slumber. But now here he is in the garden. He approaches the illumined ILLUMINED windows and hears the dread tidings from his baron, who, of course, has rejoiced at his presence. From his frightened baron he learns all the details, and lo, by degrees within his sick and disordered brain there forms a thought, one dreadful but tempting and irrefutably logical. To murder him! Take the 3,000 in banknotes and afterwards unload all the guilt onto the young baron. To whom else will anyone think to impute the deed, if not the young baron? Whom else will they accuse, if not the young baron? There is all this evidence. He was here. A terrible craving for money, for plunder might have seized his mind, together with the realization of impunity. Oh, these sudden and irresistible impulses so often arise on occasion and, above all, arise within the kind of murderer who, even a moment earlier, did not know that he intended to kill, and thus Smerdyakov might have gone into the baron's chamber and executed his plan. What with? By means of what weapon? With the first stone he picked up in the garden. But why? With what purpose? Well, 3,000, after all, that is a career. Oh, I do not contradict myself. The money might have existed, and it is even possible that Smerdyakov alone knew where to find it, the very spot in his baron's house where it lay. And the wrapping around the bills, the torn envelope on the floor? Today, when the prosecutor, in speaking of that envelope, expounded his most subtle view that to have left it on the floor would be the action precisely of an unhabituated thief, precisely a thief such as Karamazov, and not at all that of Smerdyakov, who on no account would have left such evidence against himself lying around. Today, gentlemen of the jury, as I listened, I suddenly felt that I was hearing something exceedingly familiar. And imagine, that same view, that surmised me concerning the manner in which Karamazov might have acted with the envelope. I had already heard exactly 2 days earlier from Smerdyakov, and not only that, but he had even surprised me with it. Indeed, I had the impression that he was affecting a false naivete, running to forestall me, trying to thrust this idea upon me, so that I myself should come to this same view, and was as if suggesting it to me by implication. Did he not suggest the same idea to the investigation? Did he not thrust it upon the highly talented prosecutor? It will be said, but what about the old woman, Grigory's wife? After all, she had heard the sick man groaning beside her all night. Indeed, she had. But I must say that this argument is an exceedingly shaky one. I once knew a certain lady who bitterly complained that a mongrel in the yard outside kept waking her up all night, and that she could not get no sleep for it. And yet the poor little dog, as it transpired, had only yelped some 2 or 3 times throughout the entire night, and this is natural. A man is asleep and suddenly hears a groan. He wakes up in annoyance at having been woken, but falls asleep again an instant later. Some 2 hours thereafter comes another groan. He again wakes up and again falls back to sleep. Then there is another, again 2 hours later, only 3 times, in all throughout the whole of the night. In the morning the sleeper rises and complains that someone has been groaning all night, incessantly waking him up. But it is bound to seem to him this way. The intervals of sleep, each 2 hours in duration, have passed in unconsciousness and does not remember. He remembers only the moments at which he was woken. And so it seems to him that he has been kept awake all night. But why? Why, exclaimed the prosecution, did not Smerdyakov confess in his suicide note? For one, he had sufficient conscience, but for the other, he did not, we are told. But permit me, conscience, that is already remorse, but the suicide may have felt no remorse, but only despair. Despair may be aggressively hostile and unappeasable, and the suicide, in placing hands upon his own life, may at the moment have felt redoubled hatred for those whom all his life he had envied. Gentlemen of the jury, beware of making a judicial error. What is implausible in all that I have just presented and depicted to you? Find the error in my exposition. Find that which is impossible, absurd. But if there is even a ghost of possibility, even a ghost of plausibility in my suppositions, then reserve your verdict. And is there here a ghost merely? I swear by all that is sacred, I have complete faith in my own interpretation of the murder, which I have just presented to you. But above all, I am troubled, driven out of myself by the thought that all of the mass of the facts that the prosecution has heaped on the defendant, there is not a single one that is in any way precise or irrefutable, and that the unhappy man is going to perish solely on account of the combined weight of those facts. Yes, that weight is a terrible one. That blood trickling from his fingers, those blood-stained clothes, that dark night, filled with the howl of "Father Murderer," and a man shouting, falling with a broken skull, and then this mass of utterances, statements, gestures, cries, oh, that may exert such influence, may so suborn, S-U-B-O-R-N, one's conviction. But is it able, gentlemen of the jury, is it able to suborn yours? Remember, you have been given an unbounded power, the power to bind or loose. But the mightier the power, the more terrible its exercise. Not by one iota do I retreat from what I have just said, but let us suppose that it were so. Suppose for a moment that I were to agree with the prosecution that my unhappy client steeped his hands in the blood of his father. This is only a hypothesis. I repeat that not for a second do I doubt his innocence, but say it were so, and I suppose my defendant to be guilty of parricide. But listen carefully to my words. Even though I may admit such a hypothesis, there lies within my heart the duty to express to you yet something more, for I anticipate a great struggle within your hearts and minds. Forgive me this remark, gentlemen of the jury, concerning your hearts and minds. But I want to be truthful and sincere to the end, and let us all be sincere. At this point the defense counsel was interrupted by a rather powerful burst of applause. Indeed, he had uttered his last words with a note of such sincere resonance that everyone felt that perhaps he really did have something to say, and that what he was going to say now would be the most important part. But the chairman, upon hearing the applause, loudly threatened to clear the chamber of the court if a similar instance were to be repeated. All grew quiet, and Fedyukovich began in a kind of now emotionally charged voice, not at all the same as the one he had used hitherto.